Paul Hacker is with us today on DevOps processes and migrations.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello, I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo. Go to www.azuredevops.show for past episodes and show notes. Welcome to the podcast. Our guest today is Paul Hacker. Paul is a DevOps architect at Microsoft and has over 15 years of application architecture, design, development, and management experience in Microsoft technologies. Paul has a depth of experience in ALM, process improvement, and Team Foundation Server. Paul, hello. Welcome to the show, sir.
Welcome, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me. This is great.
Yeah, I've been talking to you to get you on the show, and you've got some really interesting perspectives on what we're going to talk about today. But for those not familiar with you, I know you have joined Microsoft just in the past few years, but why don't you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your career journey and how you ended up in this role at Microsoft?
Sure. So let's just start from the beginning. I started out like a lot of folks out there. I am a self-taught software engineer in Microsoft technologies. I started out in Visual Basic 5, and I wanted to learn how to write code, and so I bought it and started learning. And when Team Foundation Server first came out in around the 2004-2005 timeframe, I jumped on that bandwagon, and I started to do what we called ALM process consulting. And really, that was nothing more than just installing Team Foundation Server at that time and showing people how to use processes around the tooling. Long story short, fast forward to 2017, Microsoft started a team called the DevOps CAT team, or the Customer Advisory Team. We are part of the engineering team at Microsoft for Azure DevOps. And they expressed interest in having me come on board, and everything worked out. And in November of 2017, I came on board at Microsoft as a DevOps architect. We're a team of about 6-7 people now around the world that does nothing but go to Microsoft's biggest customers, focusing on process improvement around DevOps processes using Azure DevOps, or migrations from on-premises TFS or Azure DevOps Server now to what they call Azure DevOps in the cloud.
Okay.
That's really kind of what I do.
And you've received several Microsoft MVP awards in a few different categories as well.
That's correct. I started out as an MVP in 2001 as C#, 2002, something like that, as a C# MVP. I was there for a few years, and then I took a break for a year as I transitioned into the TFS space. And then I became what we call a TFS MVP, and then that's transitioned and morphed into Visual Studio Technologies MVP, all the way up and until I was joined Microsoft, at which point I had to give up my MVP.
Yeah.
So about 15 years of MVP.
Awesome. So a lot of listeners of this show are longtime .NET developers, but a lot of them have just started .NET programming and shipping software in Azure in recent years. And with the stats, the number of people entering the development field has just ballooned over recent years. So we have a lot of people who were being born when you were starting as a programmer. And so right. Help the listener understand just some of the buzzwords that we throw around. Like we're talking about DevOps, but go back ALM. Where did it come around? And then there's Agile floating around, all these different processes and how they fit together so that we can kind of ground ourselves in the DevOps discussion. Sure.
So Agile has been around for quite some time. Iterative development. We've been doing it for a long time. We just called it different things. So DevOps is just a new buzzword, I would say, around that. But Agile development, Scrum, Kanban have all been going on for a few years. But ALM, for example, application lifecycle management, the idea of managing the complete application lifecycle from ideation all the way out to support is something that a lot of folks didn't really get a grasp of. I mean, they had waterfall, and you would do your design, and then you would do your development, and what there weren't a lot of tools out there addressing the full range of ideation to support in a single type tool. And that's where TFS really filled a gap from the Microsoft side, is they had this tool that could now address the full application lifecycle. And so that's kind of where ALM came from. And then it moved on to, like I say, it incorporated agile technologies, and CMMI, or what we call the maturity model, that it was incorporated into Team Foundation Server. Those have all been around for a while. And then now we kind of moved away from ALM as a buzzword, let's say, into DevOps. The idea of developers and operations folks working together, in breaking down silos with teams, and this constant idea of continuous delivery, being that we're constantly delivering software and delivering value to our customers in a quick fashion.
Okay. So for the process of DevOps, you're helping customers put those processes in place and improve them and gain better telemetry. What are some of the common challenges that people are working on?
The biggest challenge, first, let's define DevOps. If you ask 5 different people on your show, I bet you get 5 different answers. If you poll your audience, you're going to get 5 different answers from 5 different individuals on what DevOps is. Microsoft defines DevOps as the idea of people, process, and technology coming together to deliver continuous value to our customers. And so the big word there is continuous delivery of value to our customer. So when we are talking about working with customers, the biggest challenge I find is the cultural, the people process part of it. Anybody can throw a tool at it. You don't buy DevOps. I like to say DevOps is not magic. It's something that you just do, and you start small and you iterate. Hey, let's try this. Okay, great. It worked. Let's move on. If it didn't work, let's iterate. And so the biggest challenge I find, though, is the cultural aspects. The people are so resistant to change typically. That's a human nature, that we find the biggest struggle being the people process part. You either have a process you're comfortable with that may or may not work, that's difficult to change, or you don't have the right people in place. And you find it difficult to get the right people because you don't want to let go of your staff. At the same time, your staff may not want to uptrain into the new technologies or to the new processes. So those are the 2 hardest things I find with customers they struggle with.
Yeah. I look at the recruiting industry as a sign for what customers are asking them for. Because I remember in 2005 seeing recruiters who had open agile developer positions that were open. Mm-hmm. And they were these job postings. And now the definition of the union of this, I know at Microsoft, there's program manager and now there's engineer, at least in a lot of groups. It's
yes.
massively consolidated as opposed to having all kinds of different roles. But still in the broader industry, various companies think about it different ways, and some are merely renaming their operations engineers to DevOps engineers, but they're still server administrators. And so we still haven't figured it out as a broader industry.
That's right. And so while my title is DevOps Architect, I'm not a huge fan of DevOps Architect being a role in an organization. I really like Microsoft what they call their combined engineering strategy, where they combine testers, developers, operations folks into feature teams. And most of those folks are called engineers. So it's an engineering role. And I think that's it's an all-inclusive role. It includes your operations, it includes your testers, your developers, and it kind of goes to breaking down those silos. But to say I have a DevOps engineer position, well, what is a DevOps engineer really? Well, he could be a developer, could be a tester, could be an operations folk. So I'm not a huge fan of the title DevOps engineer.
Yeah, it'll work itself out.
Yeah.
But so you're helping with continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines and telemetry. Are there some patterns and rules of thumb that are starting to emerge where you can say, hey, 80% of the time, if you have a Visual Studio based application, do these set of things?
Well, yeah. So obviously, from the Microsoft perspective, we'd like to see people get into Azure DevOps, the cloud-based offering that they have. And you want to take advantage of at least the continuous delivery, continuous integration pieces that are built into it. I really think Git as a version control system is the future. Team Foundation version control, the first version of the source control system in TFS, is not going away, but it's something that's getting sidelined to Git, I think, in the industry. I really propose more Git. So what the first thing I try to do with customers is, if you're not in Azure DevOps and you're a .NET shop and you're looking to offload the maintenance of your servers and to use a tool that's really cutting edge, get into Azure DevOps with your version control into Git. Take advantage next of, let's start looking at continuous integration. It's the low-hanging fruit that most companies can take advantage of immediately. It's that continuous building of your software as you're checking it into version control. And implementing things like pull requests in Git as part of that. And then move on to the broader topics and the more advanced topics of things like continuous delivery. Heck, just get it to deliver, get it to do an automated delivery to your dev environment. Let's start there. Let's take baby steps. Don't try to go whole hog and say, we're going to deliver to production in a week and all this great stuff. It's too grandiose for most companies. So start small. My blueprint is get yourself into version control, use Git, get yourself into continuous integration, use pipelines, and then start to look at continuous delivery to at least your dev environments. After that, start to include some automated testing. Things like unit tests. We don't have to go whole hog, load testing or any of that. Just start with some unit tests and start to write unit tests. If you're not writing unit tests, get in the habit of starting to work with writing unit tests. Doesn't mean everything has to be reworked, but look at those things as your patterns to move forward.
Okay. And telemetry is part of this. What should people know about the basics there?
Yeah, so if you are working in Azure, for example, you're using Azure DevOps and you're deploying to an Azure environment, let's say, and even if you're not deploying to Azure, but you're using a Windows environment or some type of environment that you're deploying to, that you can take advantage of what we call application insights. Application insights is the monitoring technology for Azure. It can grab a lot of data. We use it at Microsoft not only to check the condition of our instances, like our performance, how are we performing? Are we performing in infrastructure? How is speed? How is uptime? How is load? All that type of stuff. But also we look at what features are our users actually using. So we start to take advantage of the telemetry at the feature level. To see we created this great new feature, but is anybody even using it? Also, taking and automating that back into actionable data, back into TF or Azure DevOps to become work items that we work on. So we can take, and the big thing with telemetry is knowing if you have issues or if features aren't being used or you have any issues with your environment or your application before your customer calls you up and says, hey, Tom, hey, Sally, your application really is not working, we're down, whatever. You should know all that ahead of time. And that's where telemetry comes in. And it's such an important part of the process that a lot of folks don't focus on. They leave it up to their support team or an operations team to manage that separate from the development team. And to me, it should all be part of the same team. And that data that's coming out should be actionable data put back into the system and be addressed. So yeah, telemetry is a big thing, and we use App Insights to do that.
Okay. Can you give some examples of, if you were putting together a dashboard or a periodic report of, hey, how's our application doing? What things would you include just to get started, even before you looked at how that application was unique?
Yeah, so, the first things I'd be looking at is performance, obviously. How performant is the application once it's out there? Do we need to scale the application up? Are we seeing peaks and valleys in the usage of the application that we need to be aware of? So that if, again, we're using Azure, we know how to set up how to scale this application so that we can support those types of users and that type of load that we're getting. So those are some of the first things. I'd be looking at there's other data I'd be looking at too, not just the performance of the application or the features, but I'd be actually gathering data on things like how quickly are we getting our work into from a customer. Let's say a customer files a bug, from a bug to production. Bug filing to production, our cycle time, our lead time. That type of information is also really important. And I think that we need to be gathering that and building a dashboard around that. So with a lot of customers, I'll build things like cycle time and lead time dashboards, as well as performance dashboards as to how is it performing and things like that. But I think understanding how quickly are we getting issues or features or whatever from the ideation stage into the production stage.
Okay. Now we'll take a quick pause for a word from our sponsor.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
And we're back with Paul Hacker, talking about Azure DevOps and process and migrating to it. So when you think about migrating to Azure DevOps, whether it be from Jenkins or some other product or an older version of TFS, what are you seeing out there in the marketplace as people are evaluating and adopting the platform?
I see two different scenarios. I see whole hog. We're coming from TFS. We want to go to Azure DevOps. We're Microsoft shop. We're staying on the Microsoft tool. We're going to use the TFS migrator tool to migrate as much as we can from basically our collection from TFS into Azure DevOps. The migrator tool is a fantastic tool for that. There are some nuances. If you're going to try it on your own, I suggest you read the TFS migration guide to do that. It's full of information on how you'll get about doing that. The second thing I'm seeing is people adopting it piecemeal, and they're going for things like CI/CD to start with, or Azure boards. Those are the two big ones I see. Mainly CI/CD though, where they're taking, and for example, I do a demo with a lot of organizations just to prove that Microsoft is any language, any platform type technology. I have a demo that uses GitHub Enterprise that builds with a Jenkins server. It deploys with the pipelines in Azure DevOps using Terraform to deploy to AWS. And so it just goes to show you, you don't have to adopt everything Azure DevOps immediately. If you are interested in the pipeline piece or the board piece, then by all means take advantage of that. So I see both those. I see the step-by-step approach, and then I see the whole hog. Let's move all our stuff. In fact, I'm with a customer today. I'll be going in. They're moving 356 projects from on-premises into Azure DevOps project by project. Very arduous process. Not the simplest thing. But again, that's another scenario that we're seeing happen. Is one of the things to be aware of when you migrate from Azure, from TFS to Azure DevOps, is that each collection becomes its own account, its own URL in Azure DevOps. Not everybody wants that. So they move project by project, which is a more arduous and more error-prone type way to do it. But you can do it and then migrate everything into a single collection or a single account.
Well, let's go through those steps, because there's quite a few versions of TFS there out in the wild, and builds used to be done as a Windows XAML user interface, and now that's completely different. And if people have hundreds of gigabytes in size of when they look at the TFS database in SQL Server and see the number of gigabytes that it is, and thinking, oh, how do I get this thing up in the cloud with Azure DevOps Services? Oh, and by the way, I'm several versions old on TFS. Walk us through just the steps, because there's a few key steps that we have to go through in order to migrate, and common things that are always there.
Sure. So first thing is, if you're going to use the TFS migrator tool, which is the preferred way to migrate full fidelity from your on-prem TFS to Azure DevOps, migrator only works with 2 versions behind of Team Foundation Server or Azure DevOps Server. So right now we're on, I believe it's TFS 2018 update 3 you could be on, and you could use that as a starting point, but you could not go like from 2017 TFS into Azure DevOps. You'd have to do that jump to 2018 first. There's a couple ways to do that. You may not want to upgrade your on-premises server to 2018. So what you can do is put an intermediary server into Azure and stand up basically a 2018 TFS server in Azure, do a detach and a reattach into the Azure instance, and then run your migrator tool against that. And that tends to work pretty well. Based on the amount of data you have, though, you might run into issues with your just the sheer amount of data being uploaded into Azure could take some time. So I just did one that was a 500 gig migration. The tool only handles up to about 100 gig database, collection database. Actually, there's a specific table, and it tells you in the migration guide, if this table is over a certain size, you have to use an intermediate jump server. What that means is you have to stand up a server in Azure with SQL Server and take a SQL backup and reattach it to the SQL Server in Azure and run the migrator from the TFS server in Azure. So if you got anything over 100 gigs on premises, you're going to have to make this intermediate jump. And then, again, a 500 gig database took us about 7 hours to migrate completely in a dry run, and then about 8 hours in the full fidelity run when we did the final run. So that's kind of a gauge on, again, it all depends on your bandwidth to get it into Azure. Once it's in Azure, the important thing is when you're going to Azure, let's say that you're US based, get it in the central US. You want the instance that you're going to jump from into Azure DevOps, so that jump server in the same region as your TFS instance is in. So, for example, US is central US. So central US is where you should put your jump server. Don't use East or West US. Just go to central US, create your server there, then migrate it up into Azure DevOps. So that's one thing to pay attention to. Again, the migration guides is chock full of information. But those are the few scenarios that we've seen pretty much.
And some of the data that happens to be there, not TFS specific, but for instance, SharePoint was more tightly integrated with previous TFS versions, whereas now it's not. And so the work items and the way that the projects were used could have some of those tentacles. Can you walk us through some of the common ones just because of the older dependencies that TFS used to have?
Right. So, for example, like you mentioned before, these XAML builds have gone away. So if you are coming from a XAML build environment, like my current customer, there is no migration of XAML builds really to Azure DevOps builds or the pipelines. You're going to have to manually recreate your builds because it's a task-based PowerShell JSON type of build environment, where before it was Windows workflow for XAML. The other thing is reporting. There's no data cube or data warehouse behind the scenes. So we're using things like what we've introduced is something called the analytics view, which is still in preview and still growing. So expect more to come there, with the combination of Power BI to query that data. So that's how we replace the data cube and SSRS and all that. We now use Power BI and analytics view. The other item that we want to focus on too is SharePoint. Now, SharePoint you can still integrate with SharePoint. My customer has done this. They use SharePoint Online, and they are able to get some of their, but again, I don't see any customers really using SharePoint with their TFS instances much anymore, or with their Azure DevOps instances. It's really rare. There's other tools that they use, or they store their data within their version control system in Git or within TFVC now, the documentation that they have. So Those are a few of the things to be paying attention to that aren't going to come across when you migrate up to Azure DevOps.
Mm-hmm. And everybody wants to run their systems in the cloud now. If you can say, hey, let Microsoft run this thing, versus you having to have the server environments and the SQL Server and just installing it and moving it, it's a lot of work.
Yeah. So getting it there is a lot of work. Getting rid of the maintenance is going to make your life so much better. Not only that, you get the latest features with Azure DevOps all the time. So you don't have to worry about doing updates to your server. You don't have to worry about feature parity being behind what the cloud has to offer. The downside is you take what you get in the cloud. You get those new features, and eventually, so for example, they introduced new navigation features. Before, the navigation was across the top. Now the navigation's on the left side going down. So it went from horizontal to vertical. And a lot of people were confused by that. So Microsoft gave you the opportunity to turn that feature on and off as needed. But at some point, I believe here in January, at some point, it will become a feature baked in feature. So whether you like it or not, you're going to have to use it. Mm-hmm. So just be aware of that even when you come to the cloud, you're going to take advantage of features that, as changes happen, you're going to have to adopt, those changes. And for a while, you can turn some of those features on and off through the preview feature switch. But at some point, they're fully baked in, and you've got to take advantage of that.
Some of my features, you're talking about process and application lifecycle management. Some of my favorite features are how multiple sets of stakeholders can be pulled into the process. For instance, with the cloud version, if you're using Office 365, then the stakeholders can have a seamless feedback and testing process with the Chrome test and feedback plugin and screen recording. How many times does a development team just get feedback of, hey, this feature doesn't work? And they're asking, well, wait, what environment were you on and what version was deployed at the time and what exactly were you doing? And a bug report might have one sentence because stakeholders are busy. You ask an accounts payable clerk or whoever the type of person. They're not a software person. They just happen to use the software. You ask them for feedback, but unless you're standing over their shoulder, you don't really get the information you need. And so that I've loved that test and feedback tool and the integration that it offers for that process.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, unfortunately, it's available in Chrome. I believe it's maybe even available in Firefox now, but not IE at this point. Strange. But that what they call the test and feedback tool, is for the exploratory testing, which basically means you go out there and you poke around in the application, you record what you're doing, and then you can do things like create a bug off of that. You can create a test case off of that as a work item back into Azure DevOps that you can then repeatedly use later on, even automate at some point. So that's a great feature. The other great thing, like you said, is in MTM, Microsoft's Test Manager tooling, which was the thick client that you installed in part of Test Professional, which was kind of been moved now to the web, grabs that data, and like you said, system data, things you care about, like what version, of the OS are you using, what's your processor, what's your memory, what are all these things that are happening with the system? Because and it's been true for a little while now with Microsoft tooling, if you're using it correctly, it works on my machine excuse has really gone out the window. This kind of replaced that works on my machine type of scenario where, you couldn't figure out, you're throwing it back and forth and playing ping pong with this issue, where now you could actually record the screen, you could record voice, you could record, grab a screenshot and all this system data and stick it into a defect inside of TFS or Azure DevOps and get some rich data back to the developer to work on. So your time to mean time to repair could significantly be reduced with that. That's a great point.
Some guidance that we give to our clients is for whether they be program managers or just stakeholders of all kinds, we ask them, hey, check out the new build. That's kind of what we ask them. Mm-hmm. And what we ask them is, before you even do anything, just open it up, start recording, because best case scenario, you poke around and you find no issues. Worst case scenario, you have a bug and you have all the context leading up to it. But really good information happens when they come back and say, oh, everything works great. Let me give you an example. One of the bits of feedback that was essentially just tacit, the stakeholder didn't even know that they were giving this feedback or that was there, but they're using the program and they come in to a particular screen and they have to type in an order number, and of course they know these order numbers in this field, and so they open up the page and they click in the order number and they type it and they go to the next page and then they click in the next text box and type something else, and they're going to town and they say, hey, it looks great. But then the development team just watching effectively virtually over their shoulder is saying, wait a minute, why are they clicking there? They're always clicking in that order text box. why aren't we auto-focusing that text box? The stakeholder didn't know to ask for that, but the developers were able to see all of those unnecessary clicks, and because it was in their workflow, they were doing it all the time.
Yeah, right.
And so just a quick JavaScript, focused line, and boom, it's even made better. It's such a simple change, but just being able to see what the user was doing, they made the system better and more efficient, but the stakeholder's not going to know to ask for those types of things.
Yeah, that's a great point. And when we talk stakeholder feedback, a lot of folks aren't aware of this one tool. And this isn't really testing as it is the feedback request tool that's built into Azure DevOps. And it's a lightweight feedback client you would install on your machine. And what I mean is you are working let's say you're working in a sprint. And as a developer or an engineer, you're doing something and you want the stakeholder to look at this particular item. Before you get to the end of the sprint and do your sprint review and show it off, you want to make sure it's right. Am I meeting your expectations for this particular story? And the feedback client allows you to actually request or query the stakeholders and say, stakeholder, would you go out there and please test this URL, test these particular features that I want you to look at, and would you give me some feedback on that? And then they get an email when you send that off. They install this lightweight feedback client. It allows them to record the screen, take screenshots, record their voice, put notes, and give feedback back to the team. These are work items that are tracked in Azure DevOps that you just don't go and create a typical work item of a feedback request or a feedback response. They're created using the tool. But it's another way to get that feedback from the end user and watch what they're doing and understand, are we meeting the needs of our stakeholders, or is there something we picked up on, like you said, that, hey, we had no idea they had to do that. Let's fix that before we even get to the end of the sprint and show it in a sprint review. That's a tool that is available that anybody can use, and a lot of people don't even know it exists.
That's a really good point. And there's so many features that harken back to TFS versions of years ago that are still there, or even been refined. But with the tool automatically creating work items that, hey, I'm asking for feedback, now lead time and cycle time start to be affected, because on our project dashboard, we can see that there's a bottleneck starting to emerge because we have a particular lead time that is growing for the work, those types of work items. Because if you could have a big problem if you're asking for feedback and then 2 weeks later the feedback, maybe it comes then or maybe it doesn't come, but then when they finally do test a build holistically, then they say, oh, this is wrong, and then you say, well, you're taking 2 weeks just to provide feedback. How do we fix this process?
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the great things about it, is because it's all being tracked very much like a lot of different items in TFS that are being tracked as work items that you would normally just go out and create. Things like code reviews, for example, were one of the features that was a work item that you could do in Visual Studio if you were using TFVC, for example. You could do code reviews. It was a work item. And again, the feedback client's a work item. It's a great way for you to be able to say, hey, I'm asking for this feedback and I'm not getting what I need. And we're tracking that as, like you say, as lead time or cycle time. So, yeah.
One of in the yellow DevOps handbook, one of the principles is make work visible, and it's literally make all work visible. If something needs to be done by anybody, it needs to be visible and generically in whatever tool. So in our case, it needs to be a work item. If anybody is supposed to do anything, it needs to be a work item of some type, not an email, not a Slack message, but some type of work item in the process template.
Right. Because you want to get away from this fact of, writing on a napkin or emails or any of that type of stuff where it's very loose and not very well tracked. And you can't do reporting on it. You can't track any kind of telemetry on it. You want to get away from that and use the tool and, like you say, make it visible, because once it's become visible, people can't hide from it anymore. They have to address it if they want to get better. And really, that's really what DevOps is all about, is continuous improvement. I mean, we don't arrive at DevOps. We don't buy DevOps. We don't hire DevOps. We do DevOps.
Yeah, we practices.
Improve.
Yep. Okay, well, before we go, Paul, is there any other resources that our listeners should follow up on?
Yeah, so there's a couple of resources that, and I don't know if you have show notes, Jeffrey. I can send you some links for your
Absolutely, we do
for your show notes. But I'll tell you 3 different resources I really enjoy. One of them is the feature resource. It's it tracks all the features Microsoft is going to be working on for this particular year. For example, it'll tell you, okay, these are the things we're thinking about doing this year. And at what quarter are we going to do them in, or have we done them? Or are they not even on the radar at this point? They're just thoughts. The other one is the Azure DevOps status dashboard, which has been reworked. It tells you the status of all the different functionality in Azure DevOps, the boards, the pipelines, the build servers, the hosted instances, all that type of stuff. What's their status? So you can see real time what's going on. And the last one is anybody that's really interested in jumping into the DevOps pool and is not sure how folks are doing it at scale. Microsoft has a site, DevOps at Microsoft, and I tell this story to my customers all the time, is how Microsoft does DevOps, how we went from delivering software every 3 years or 2 years to every 3 weeks in this 8-year journey we've been on, and all the pros and cons and the good and the bad and everything are all things that we and then I can send you those links, and there's videos and blog posts and on that and how we do DevOps at Microsoft. One of the last things I don't really suggest, it's not a link, it's a book I read, and it was a really interesting book because it sums up what a lot of companies do. They try stuff, and if it doesn't work, they iterate. And it was everything I learned about business, I learned from the Grateful Dead. And what that book is about is how this band started things like online ticket sales, and how to mail in ticket orders, and how to stamp your own vinyl because your producer wasn't doing it right, and all these problems they ran up against, and all these struggles they came against, and how they addressed them, and how they iterated over them, and how they learned from them and moved on. And that's really kind of what Microsoft does: is we hit the wall, we find a solution, we iterate on that solution, and we move on. And a lot of companies need to adopt that type of mentality if they want to be successful with DevOps, I think. Is continually trying to improve. And like I said, it's not magic. Start slow and move forward.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Paul, for visiting with me. This is a great show.
I appreciate it, Jeffrey. Thanks so much for having me. It was great talking with you.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.